Welcome to the Honest Health Podcast with your host, Jeffrey Burke. Honest Health brings you the brightest minds in the natural products industry, as well as athletes and entertainers. Jeff will keep you entertained and informed while educating on how to be successful on your healthy journeys. Now, here's your host, Jeffrey Burke.
Hello and welcome back to the Honest Health Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Burke. I'm so glad you're here. Another great show for you today. Of course, always education and information in a energetic, fun, and engaging style, because that's what it's all about. You know, today we want to know more. We want to learn more. So I'm bringing you the best minds in the natural products industry. Soon, I'm going to be branching off into professional athletes. I've got some people in the know and some entertainers that are coming on. And I just want you to be able to enjoy yourself. Many of you have been listening to me for over 4 decades on my radio show. If you're new to me, welcome. If you aren't, welcome back. So glad you're here. So today, we're going to be talking about probiotics. You know, probiotics are things we've been hearing about for a long time, but there's been a lot of changes. As we think about them, the things that they do, new studies, new technology. So we're going to be talking about that today. My good friend Bruce Topping is here today. Bruce has been involved in the alternative medical community his entire life by managing health food stores, working as a health coach, conducting seminars in all 50 states, as well as being an activist for small and local agriculture. He's a consummate student of natural medicine with special focus on digestive health and microbiome research. Based on his wealth of knowledge, Bruce has become a director of product development for a leading nutritional supplement company. I think you're going to really enjoy this today. Hey, Bruce, how are you?
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me on today, man. What a cool opportunity.
It's awesome. You know, you and I have done so many radio shows and, you know, of course we didn't have cameras, so I could have really bad hair days and it was all good. And, you know, but now we get to see each other and engage. And, you know, this is going to be a fun topic. Probiotics. You know, I remember when we just thought that they were something you take for 3 days after an antibiotic, but boy, have we learned a lot.
It has been. I feel like light years have been moved since I started in the industry, and I'm not even as veteran as you. I only have like 100 years or something. I think you've got me well beat there. But yeah, you're right. It has been an incredible amount of changes. I think there's been a lot of different almost eras in the industry. I think I'll say that it's maturing. Like we've got a more mature industry. And I think we've learned a ton. There's, over at 1,200 clinical trials now, whereas in the 90s, it was like a few dozen.
Yep.
So things have changed.
You know, the interesting thing is if someone had ever asked me if I would take a probiotic, let's say 15 years ago, that was not in a refrigerated situation, I would have said, absolutely not. I mean, I used to panic. I'd be going somewhere and I'd pack it, and then I would get to where I was going. I'd unpack my suitcase and put it into an ice bucket if there wasn't a refrigerator, and it'd be the last thing that I would pack and the first thing I would unpack when I got to where I was going, because I was just so intent on keeping it cold and cool. And, you know, it's a different world now. You know, technology is changing. You know, a lot of us old dogs in the field, we've had to rethink things and relearn things and keep our minds and hearts open to changes in technology. But, you know, shelf-stable probiotics, that was pretty changing for the industry.
You're right, Jeff. I still remember being a buyer in a health food store in the 90s when a sales rep gave me bottles out of their trunk that were like hot to the touch. It's like, here you go. Here's some samples for the staff. Dole these out. And they put the probiotic bottles in my hand, and it's like hot, from the summer in the trunk. And I remember like getting upset, like to your point, right? Like I'm actually kind of resentful that this person has destroyed these living cells. Why don't you care about these products? But yeah, I think you're right. That's a big one. Just the packaging, the notion of, are these cells just going to wither and die as soon as they hit 100 and 110 degrees, or if they sit in the car on the car ride home? I still remember customers like asking for cooler bags.
Oh, yeah.
In their mind, it's just withering the entire time they pull it out of the shelf. They're going to drive fast and like dive to the fridge when they walk in the door. And I think you're right. It's when you really get into the data that's available nowadays, you just get a different view. I mean, it's more nuanced and more complex. But I think you come away feeling better about the art of probiotics.
I think so too. A lot of people will ask, they'll say, why would I want probiotics? It's in their mind, I don't take antibiotics. I really don't take a lot of medication. Why am I a candidate? And I think that's the first question a lot of people ask, because when we're talking gut health, I talk about enzymes, I talk about greens, and I definitely talk about probiotics. But some people say, well, I don't have any problems. Why would I need a probiotic? How would you
Yeah,
answer that?
that's a good question. And I guess for me, it's, I'm always pretty like, it always depends on what you're trying to do. Probiotics are a tool, but I'll say that
Hmm.
as supplements go, we're trying to fill in gaps in our diet and lifestyle. And one of the worst ones, I would say, I mean, let's be real, like what's in a multivitamin is mostly B vitamins, some minerals, some antioxidants. You can get that at Taco Bell, even, right? Even a hamburger and fries has some B vitamins in it. I'm not recommending you eat fast food, right? But it's still like those are more available. Whereas the living bacteria that humans used to get in our food supply is mostly gone. And I think that nowadays we've gotten aware that your digestive tract is linked to your brain, it's linked to your nervous system, it's linked to your skin. There's so many areas of health that we're now seeing are not necessarily controlled by the biome, but heavily influenced. And I think that if you're enjoying radiant health today and you're asking that question as like, I just did a triple backflip and a handspring into the health food store, and now I'm asking Bruce, do I need a probiotic? It's like, well, maybe not. I mean, especially if your diet is pretty diverse and you're getting a lot of good prebiotic fibers in your diet. I
Hmm.
have seen cultures. I was reading about traditional cultures in Japan, and some of them actually didn't eat fermented foods, which was rare in Japan. And
Hmm.
they found that their microbiomes were still pretty healthy because they were getting a pretty good supply at birth from mother's milk. And then there was almost no antibiotics or pesticides or, chlorine residue. There was not much to really damage their biome. So in that setting, I'll say they may not need it. But I think for most of us, there's really a major need to get more probiotics into our diet, either from fermented food, which is hard unless you're making it yourself. It's really that what they sell in the store is mostly watered down Mickey Mouse versions that are like mush, with barely any living cells, compared to the zesty, crunchy thing you can make at home, or buy if you're willing to pay for the more artisanal brands. But yeah, I'd say it's just hard to get these things, and there's so many levers that are being pulled in the gut that unless
Yeah.
you're enjoying radiant health, you probably do want to support your microbiome, especially in the face of modern industrial diets.
And I'm someone that every day I take my probiotics, and sometimes I take them twice a day. And being on the road as much as I've been, I take a good amount of probiotics every day, and I rely on them because I've seen the difference when, of course, I love to do these stupid little things to myself where I'll go off of something for a while just to see ridiculously if I feel different. Of course, I always do. So then I go back on it again, but I still yet do these tests to myself for whatever reason. But I mean, probiotics are things to me that I consider a staple. I put them way at the very top because I think we have to be able to process and build a good digestive system and a good, friendly bacterial kind of situation in our gut. So for me, a digestive enzyme and a probiotic are at the top of my list, even underneath the vitamins, to your point, because I think that it's essential. And it's been a lot more convenient for me because of traveling to not have to, run and knock people over to get to a refrigerator to throw them in there. So that's been wonderful. But a lot of people will still say, that mentality is still out there. I need to take these for 7 days after my antibiotics, and that's the way I was taught.
Mhm.
In the very early 80s, that's how you recommended a probiotic. I'll never forget. The first one I ever saw said 70 million biological bacteria on it. And I'd never seen the word million on a product before. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is huge. And it
Totally.
was like 2 or 3 years later, they came out with a super version and it was 3.5 billion. And I was like, ugh, 70 to 1. I mean, oh my goodness. And that was groundbreaking. But boy, we've gone a lot higher than that today, and probably for good reason.
Yeah, that is you're hitting on a personal fascination of mine of like, where is the sweet spot for the cell count when it comes to probiotics and supplements? And I feel like I've worked for different companies where we had different sort of visions, right?
Hmm.
Like some companies I've worked for were more heroic dosages, right? Like take 100 billion a day, or even 500 billion, or a trillion cells a day. I've seen formulas, Jeff, that are 3 trillion in the serving now, right? And then to
Wow.
your point, I've also seen formulas that are like 50 million sitting on the shelf, right? So it's like a 1,000-fold, difference in the potency. And it's weird because I don't think you see that with vitamin E or like calcium supplements. If you walk in and like buy calcium, it's not like, well, do you want 1 milligram, sir? Or how about 1,000 milligram? It's like there's not,
Yeah.
it's not like that type of range of supplemental, potency range. And I think probiotics are kind of unique in that regard. I'll say that I think those heroic dosages that I used to be into, or I would sometimes take like trillions of cells at a whack, I think those are really generally diminishing returns. Like you'll take 10 times more and not even get 1% additional benefit that you would have if you took 50 billion or 25 billion. I think I've become convinced, like when you look at the NIH or the World Health Organization or all these think tanks that study probiotic literature and go through all the trial data, it's kind of shocking how low their recommendations are. It's like the World Health Organization, I think officially right now, is recommending that you get over 1 billion per day.
Wow.
Over 1 billion.
Ooh. Ooh.
No, and we certainly see formulas that are way higher than that. I think that the trial data has shown benefits even at the 25, 10, even 5 billion, depends on the strain and the scenario. But there's been a lot of trials. Probably the biggest volume of data is out there on antibiotic associated diarrhea, like you mentioned. That was kind of where everybody started with probiotics, was like, well, if I get on the antibiotics, I better kind of hold off the disruption. And there was a lot of controversy about, should you wait? Should you take them at the same time? Does it matter? Will it reduce the effectiveness of the antibiotic if I'm swallowing a probiotic at the same time? A lot of concerns like that, and most of those have been put to bed. I guess we should, at this point in our podcast, say that I think if you're in that question and you're wondering whether you should take a probiotic with an antibiotic or whether you should wait till the end of the course of the antibiotics, the data is pretty clear on that one. I think it's now the consensus among all the researchers that you should start your probiotic on the same day and go throughout the entire course of your antibiotics, and even continue the probiotic for a little time after. So in terms of the coursework over days, complete the whole course. And then there's also the question about the timing during the day. Can I take my amoxicillin with my acidophilus? Can I swallow them in the same mouthful of water? Right. And I think when I've investigated that question, it really turns out that it probably depends on the antibiotic that you're taking. Like a lot of antibiotics are absorbed into the portal circulation of your bloodstream, and then they're kind of, that's how they work all over the body, right? It's not just in the gut that it's doing the work. And when I've gotten from experts and other researchers is that you're probably not going to have much interaction unless it's one of those narrow spectrum antibiotics like a neomycin or Xifaxan, or those ones that are more specialized for irritable bowel stuff that typically are for intestinal overgrowths. Those are the ones you probably do want to separate by a few hours in terms of the timing dose. But for everybody else, I'm actually impressed that there's definitely trials out there where they took them in the same mouthful of water. It's like the antibiotic and the probiotic together. And it seemed like there was really not much evidence that they were fighting each other or competing or reducing the benefits of each other. So I think just make it easy on people. Take it every day you're on the antibiotic, and don't even worry about the timing unless you're on one of those rare IBS type antibiotics.
Well, and I think the reason there was that mentality was, in the very beginning, probiotics were very, very weak. I mean, there wasn't a lot of culture. There wasn't a lot of potency. So to take it with your antibiotic, obviously you do lose a little portion of your probiotics, but there was only a little portion in it.
Not much.
So I think that's why so many people waited to take them after. But I really do like that they've actually, because I look at it this way, even if you lose a little bit, you're still restoring a whole bunch. And you're not putting yourself into a very, very deep hole that you have to dig yourself out of, because that's where we get into things like yeast and bacterial infections and things that may come after using an antibiotic. So if you are reestablishing flora and you are putting good bacteria back in along the way, even if you lose a tiny little portion, it's still worth the effort. So to your point, I think it's important. Now, let me ask you a question. How long do probiotics stay in our system? I mean, how long do they stay in our gut? How long do they stay in the tissue? I mean, is there like a period of time before we, you know, lose them?
Yeah. So there's a lot of kind of locality of where these cells live. And there's all
Mhm.
these gradients in our body. First, nutrient gradients, like what sugars are in the small intestine. You're going to have microbes in the small intestine, the front section, that are better at metabolizing simple sugars, and they'll hang around there a lot better. Whereas by the time you get to the colon, all those simple sugars have been depleted. So the types of microbes that live in the colon are going to be different. There's also going to be gradients from the immune system. You have to remember that the immune system is this incredibly maybe the most active right there in the small intestine, because it's intuitively, you understand it's an absorptive. It's where stuff is going into the blood. You can't be fortified in just a big barrier. It has to be sort of open. And so this is where your immune system is constantly regulating the cells. Like if they get too close, then there's an immune reaction to move our own intestinal bacteria away from those entry points into our blood. And then, of course, there's a gradient from the lumen out to the middle of the gut, right? So it's like if you think about the tube inside of your gut, there's a whole bunch of bacteria packed out on the surface, out near the walls of the epithelium and all the little crypts. But out in the middle of the lumen, there just isn't as much. And interestingly, to your question, a lot of what keeps the cells in the gut from getting washed away is the mucus layers. And it was a long time in my career before I really understood how important this matrix of carbohydrate that is built in your own gut, like you make these mucoids and mucus type fractions that are kind of a lattice work, like a matrix in the gut, in the lumen. And a lot of bacteria are actually eating and kind of fueling themselves somewhat, or at least some of them are eating that mucus and staying alive that way. So it turns out your gut does produce a lot of mucus, and it's not all bad. Some of that is actually really critical to keeping the cells in there. We've learned that what's kind of amazing is that there's these microbes that do actually penetrate past the mucus, where there's what they call crypts that are in the gut, in the lining there. And this is where the stem cells live that actually produce the epithelial tissue to kind of repair that stuff. And as of a few years ago, they were still teasing out what those cells are doing and what their function is. But we don't know, even though we don't know their function completely, we do know that if a cell localizes in one of those crypts, that it's like they've hit the jackpot and they can now kind of control and dominate that space. And so I think to the question of, do they persist in your colon, really has to do with, well, what cells are already in the niches and crypts of your gut? Because what the data has shown is that for a lot of people, when they take probiotics, about 2 weeks after they've stopped supplementing probiotics, it's mostly washed out. They're not seeing those specific strains and signatures in their stool any longer. But in the people who are lacking those particular strains or species, they will see pretty regular persistence. Even some of the trials show it over a year. So it's like, no, the probiotic did colonize and it did grow, and now it's in your kind of milieu of strains that live in your colon. So I think it really depends on what you got living there and how it's attuned with the immune system. But it has a lot to do with the carbohydrate and mucus layers and a lot to do with the immune system.
Well, if you pick up a box of probiotics today and you're comparing brand for brand, label for label, and even products within the same line, because we know that there's companies that make so many, it's very confusing. And so here's the question that comes in. You read all these different strains of probiotics. Is it better to use a blend? Is it better to use a single strain of a probiotic? Obviously, it probably depends once again.
Yeah, and I love that we're covering all these, Jeff, because it's like people walk in and it's like, well, how many cells should I take? As we talked about, there's 3 trillion or 1 million,
Yeah.
and then it's
Yeah.
how many strains should I take? What's the diversity of the product? And this is where I've seen probably that there's efficacy in both paths. I've seen good trial data on a single strain that exists, and I've seen a lot of good trial data on multi-strain formulas. I'll say that both can work. But I think that the general clinicians that are in the field, the ones working in the clinics, the gastroenterologists that are on the front lines, whenever I talk to those guys about this question, I feel like they're moving towards the multi-strain function, or that's what they're recommending more. Now, how many strains is still a big question. When I say multi, does that mean 3, or does that mean 30, right? And I think that's still being teased out in the literature, but I'll say that probably you don't need 150 different strains. And like you said, I think we're slicing the bread pretty thin sometimes in the industry, right? Where it's like we've got 4 different forms of Lactobacillus acidophilus, and that's fascinating too. We can talk about that, the whole strain within the species, right? It's like acidophilus is the species, and then we have different sort of breeds or strains within that. And there's a whole frontier in the industry now that's promoting and researching those individual strains and saying that, hey, this one acidophilus, this one we studied, it is way better. It's like a super acidophilus. And so there's all these claims about the value of declaring at the strain level versus where you and I were at, 15 years ago. It was like, nobody did that. You just bought acidophilus on the shelf, and maybe you had longum and bifidum and other species, but you didn't see this chopping it up really fine where it's like 10 different versions of rhamnosus. They're all the same species, but different ones. So I'll say that to me is a really fascinating area. And I kind of suspect that we just need more literature. I mean, I actually looked around for differences at the strain level. Like I wanted to see research on, say, like the same species, like acidophilus, but 2 different strains, and then studied on the same outcome. Like they want to study them both on antibiotic-associated diarrhea and see if there were real differences in the how well they worked in the trials. And what I found was there's almost none of those trials, Jeff. It's like the industry's moved way out ahead. I feel like the industry's way out on the skis on this one because there is good preliminary evidence. Like we see the genetic signatures and they are different. And what little trials there are, I found one good published trial and it did show a difference at the strain level. So there is some compelling, maybe call it preliminary evidence that there is sufficient and meaningful differences at the strain level where you should be buying that super strain of acidophilus maybe. But on the other hand, as a formulator, I feel like I can't hang my hat on one trial. It's like I found one trial, therefore I'm going with that. I'm going to pay 50% more for my strain blend and make that available to my customers. I guess I'm still, that's one of the great controversies left in the industry is what about the selection of the strain? And I think the industry is very promotional right now. I go to the trade shows and there's companies saying, we've got 6,000 strains in our catalog. And I think to myself, is there really a huge difference among the 100 Bulgaricus strains that you're offering? Or is this really, like I say, slicing the bread super, super thin and making a big catalog out of what is really very similar options?
And sometimes it's not just numbers.
Yeah.
It's just because you have a bigger number doesn't really mean that much. But let me ask you another question. Here are 3 terms that people hear, they read about, they hear on podcasts, they read about in their magazines: prebiotic, probiotic, postbiotic.
Yeah.
There's some confusion there too.
Oh my gosh. I feel like we chopped up these words and everyone's like saying biotic that, biome. It can be tricky to keep track of. I think the easy ones are the prebiotics because they're just fibers basically. And what they'll say is that technically all prebiotics are fiber, but not all fiber is prebiotic. So it kind of gets into that, well, which fibers are they? The special fibers that feed all the cells. Prebiotics are, I think, one of the underexplored areas of our industry a little bit. I mean, they're gaining ground, they're gaining momentum, but they've never been as sexy. And I think that's because it's not a living cell. It's not having this dynamic quality. It just seems like fiber, and fiber isn't sexy at all. But it turns out that special fibers really are needed in our diet and are mostly gone. I mean, our Western diets this is probably one of the huge deficiencies in our culture today, is that we're just not eating the dark green leafy vegetables and the legumes and the beans and we're eating a lot more breads, cheese and meat, eggs, and, a lot more refined foods. And that means we just don't have all those dense fractions of special fiber that feed and bloom the good guys in our intestine. And we tend to see, I think, the rate of overgrowths is near epidemic, right? I think a lot of people have sort of blooms that are happening in their small intestine because they're feeding so many simple sugars. And this is, I think, one of the great causes of all the IBS that people are experiencing, all the different syndromes of nerve and gut problems that are somewhat related to overgrowths in the intestine. And that's somewhat related to their fiber fractions that are going in there. It's just feeding all the opportunists every day. And it's fun to eat that way. It's fun to eat burgers and fries. But the prebiotics are the ones that are the fibers, right? We need those prebiotics. The probiotics are the main show. That's the cells, pro meaning for life. And then the postbiotics are all the stuff they make in their life cycle, all the various peptides, and there's all these growth factors that are being talked about, pieces of the dead cell wall, like even deactivated cells where they kill the probiotics intentionally through heat or enzymes or some new method. They're killing all the cells, and then you're getting all the cell wall fragments and all the intracellular compounds that were making up that cell. That's one of the great areas that I'm fascinated with, and I'm still a big student of how important are those postbiotics. You have companies out there saying it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that you don't even need the cells anymore. And according to them, you just take the dead cell walls, and that's sufficient. I wonder if some of that is commercially fueled, Jeff, because of it's so much easier to make that product. I mean, one, it's way cheaper. The stability is perfect because there's no living cells to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also, you can patent it and have intellectual property, and nobody can take it home and grow them in their lab right from your bottle and just, culture the cells and start selling them. So I kind of wonder if some of that is like commercially fueled. But on the other hand, I have seen that fermented foods full of those postbiotic compounds do have a lot of special benefits. And I think there's a lot of rising interest in the research on postbiotics. So it's, again, pre for the fibers, pro for the living cells, post for all the stuff they make or the dead cell fragments themselves.
If you had to say men or women are probably more going to be in need of a probiotic, is it based on that, or is it just based on being human, a person?
That's a good question. I think that the research and the literature is probably leaned more toward women, specifically because of urogenital research. There's a lot of areas looking at vaginitis and vaginosis and kind of regulating pH and fungal growth. So there's, in terms of the research, probably has leaned more toward women. But your question isn't really just about what is the research focused on. It's more about who needs it more.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I think a lot of men have pretty crappy diets, and women are often the ones who are thinking more about health. They're the ones who are often the kind of making their husbands eat better, making them get to the gym. I know my wife kicks my butt to get to the gym, right? So I think that probably men need it more, ironically, because men don't tend to care about their health until it hurts. And that's when we'll go to the doctor and start talking about
until body parts are falling off.
My arm doesn't work, honey. What do I do?
It's dead.
So
True.
That's probably men, unfortunately, but they're not the ones going into health food stores or buying fermented foods and, doing the right stuff.
How do you feel about children starting on probiotics? Essential?
I think there can be an amazing tool, and I do give my kids probiotics, especially when they're eating foods which I know might upset their tummy, like if we're traveling and we're going to eat foods which I normally wouldn't eat at home. I think they can be really useful tools for helping with skin support. I think they can be really useful tools as an immune bolster. It's certainly when in the winter when there's people dropping like flies and all the kids are coming home with sniffling and colds. That's usually when I'll kind of bump up the probiotic regimen. Essential, I think that, again, I'll carve out a certain group of people who are actually eating fermented foods regularly, like authentic ones, not the mush, the Mickey Mouse versions, but the real deal. I think if you're doing that pretty regularly, you're getting a probiotic. So you probably don't need to supplement. But most of us aren't. And this is also where I would look at traditional diets. Like, it turns out refrigeration changed our diet pretty abruptly in terms of our species. And it looks like most of us used to get a lot more prebiotics and probiotics and postbiotics in our daily diets. And that's all been, it's now chlorine dipped, ammonia bathed, clinically sterilized. It's gone through all kinds of treatments. And we're left with a product with great shelf life, which is amazing for sales and commerce. But it doesn't do our gut any good. And I think after a couple of generations of this, we're learning that our kids often are suffering early. They're starting to see changes in their gut that aren't healthy even at age 10 or 12. So yeah, I think it can be essential, but I'll carve out a niche of people who are doing it right.
Well, let me ask you another question. It seems today that our digestive systems are in a very, very dreadful place, and a very large portion of the society that we live in today are so severely annoyed by the symptoms of these poor digestive systems that they will take products that basically shut everything down. It shuts down their acid pumps, these acid proton pump inhibitor products.
Yeah.
So let's say these people have a compromised digestive system, or they're themselves compromising the digestive system. Do they need a certain kind of a delivery system to make it effective? Are we maybe looking at like enteric coating? Are we looking more towards something that breaks down maybe in a 2-stage process? Where do they go? Where do they start?
Yeah, thank you. This is another great. I love that everywhere you go in probiotics, whether it's the number of strains, the diversity of strains, the how you're shipping them, or how they're delivered and coated and wrapped. I mean, that this is has been a big industry focus point. There's been a lot of debate. I've worked for companies that were pretty vehement that you had to have coatings, and they did have a lot of good support. There's gastric simulators where they've put the probiotics into these machines that bathe them in acid or bile. And you can see, yes, indeed, the cells do die. A lot of them are dead at the end of the simulator.
True.
And so it's given the industry sort of a big controversy. There's also a lot of people that would point to food, like I was just mentioning, probiotic foods. Fermented foods aren't enteric coated. You're not wrapping your sauerkraut in any type of special polymers or anything to make it go through the stomach. So I've seen the arguments on both sides. To your point about people with wrecked digestion who are on the proton pump inhibitors, all the different drugs that block acid, your stomach acid, they probably don't even have as much to worry about in terms of the stomach acid degrading them and killing off their cells. But I think there's probably more challenge down in the colon in terms of competing other microbes. So it's going to be harder for the strains, even though the acid doesn't kill them because their acid levels are low. There may be a lot of competition of what you might call opportunists, the bad guy strains that are living in their colon, and therefore it makes it difficult for any good guys to really get a leg up. So I think it's a complex picture. I think that for a lot of people, they might try a good quality diverse formula and see how that works for them. And I would suggest taking it at night, right after dinner is probably the best time. We haven't talked about that whole timing controversy yet. We can get there.
That was next. So good.
Awesome. I'm jumping ahead. So the whole idea of getting on a good quality probiotic and trying that out and seeing how that works for you. I think whether it's coated or not depends a lot on the strains that are used and also the gut end user's gut that it's going into. I'll say that I'm not convinced that every single product needs to be coated, but I'll say that I have seen people report benefits from superior outcomes from some of these coated supplements. So I think not all coatings are created equal, right? There's when people hear a coating, some of them are made from milk protein, some of them are use fish protein, some of them use. I've seen all kinds of different coatings and polymers in my career, and I think some of them truly are better than others. But I'm not sure, and this is where the jury I think is still out, that we've seen a lot of benefit on trials that didn't use any enteric coating or delivery system at all. And I can't look at the literature and deny that, even though I have seen benefits from the coated ones. So I don't think it's like crucial that you get a coated formula necessarily, but I will say for some of these coatings, I think these delivery systems can make the product more effective and maybe even be the game changer for some folks. Like you say, if they've got a huge amount of competition, a lot of opportunistic bad guy strains living in their colon, they may want a bigger payload of intact cells arriving at the large intestine all in one big affront to really go after the bad guys and change the landscape. So I think the coatings they may turn out to be very essential, but right now there's still a lot of support for uncoated formulas.
Can you take too many probiotics?
Not really. I mean, I think that it becomes a waste of money at a certain point, and I think you'll have okay, so I'll admit I have tried, right? I've worked for companies where I just had a lot of probiotic powders, and I thought, well, I read so-and-so on the internet say he took 100 trillion today. And I was young enough once and stupid enough to just go ahead and try things like that. And I'll say that my results were like a lot of gurgling and a lot of like little eructations, maybe you'd call it, of your intestine. And your stool was not of great quality because you're just moving so many cells out, and often it's kind of like a little, your body's, I think, realizes that this is not a typical healthy movement necessarily. And so I really don't think that you need to take 100 trillion or even 3 trillion a day. Maybe there are cases where that's necessary. I don't want to say that there's never a time and a place for those heroic dosages. Maybe there is. But I think for most people who are walking into a health food store, they probably don't really ever need to look over 100 billion unless they're in that rare setting where they're really needing intense, super intense, heroic type dosages. And I also wonder, Jeff, if even the 100 billion might be too much. I mean, this is where I still get, it's almost like the last article you read, right? It's like,
Yeah.
if I read one paper and it said 15 billion worked great and there's 3 trials and they were really well designed and it did show major improvements in all these markers. And I'm like, okay, well, geez, you don't need 100 billion. I just finished the trial. I read it. It convinced me. And then a month later, I'm reading some other trial where they, it's like we had 2 arms. One arm was only taking 20 billion. The other arm was getting 100, and they got way better results than the 100 billion. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe I got to rethink my thoughts on that other one. So I guess I'm still in that phase where it probably is too nuanced and there's too many variables about which strains and what diversity and how they're delivered and was it shipped cold, how was it packaged with desiccants. There's a lot of variables. And this is where I would say, I should mention, don't price shop probiotics. Like, I wouldn't go into the store and just be like, well, what's the cheapest one? I see one for $9 and it says, or do a math on how many cells per dollar. I think that often you get a cut rate formula with usually just a huge amount of plantarum. It's the cheapest strain to formulate with typically. So there'll be a massive blend of plantarum or maybe lactus, and there will be one, like the rest of the ratio is really cut down. It's like 90% those two, and not shipped cold, no desiccants, not as good of testing. Don't price shop probiotics is one of the things I would say.
Well, we have such a great selection of awesome health food stores around the country, and I love the idea of mom and pops and small chains, and even larger chains. When they do it right, they've got a lot of training, and people are just very energetic. And I've been able to meet so many amazing people as I've been traveling around the country, for such a long time. And I tell people all the time, when you walk in, have a discussion with the people that are in those departments. They can answer your questions. They can help you kind of, put your focus in and right to where you need to be focusing, because you may find that after a couple of questions, what you were thinking really isn't even the same ballpark. You take the suggestion, you think to yourself, I never thought of that. That makes more sense for me, because it's not what's good for everybody, because they still have that everybody fits in the same box. They need to throw that box away because it doesn't work. Everybody's different. Everybody's coming from a different place, eating different foods, different level of stress. Their bodies are either strong or weak, and their heredity and genetics and all of these things are different. So, but if you ask questions about you and utilize the talent that's in these health food stores, you're going to be able to narrow in and get laser focused on some of the things that'll be the best for you. And that's when we see results. Just guessing and grabbing, I mean, you may get lucky. Chances are you won't.
I like that, Jeff. I mean, part of hearing you say that makes me think about your and my career. We've been working for decades, literally, to go out there and create armies of better health food store workers that know their stuff. I mean, I know I've spoken for thousands of hours in front of retailers and tried to give careful tutorials on how to walk people through all these controversies. I mean, you and I have had 30 minutes today to talk about strain selection, cell count, how it's delivered, what kind of delivery systems, what about postbiotics. There's so many areas, but I think you're exactly right, Jeff. A lot of people will feel lost. They'll walk in and look at this huge landscape of bottles and all these different technologies and different Latin words that represent all the species and strains that are on these bottles. And I can forgive them for feeling overwhelmed.
Oh, I get
So I
it.
think you're right.
I get it. It is confusing. And, every time we get a little cocky and you think you know it all, guess what? You don't. And you read another study and you're like, oh, no, I have to change that mentality because what I knew 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and just a year ago,
Yeah.
now it's been changed.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work, and being in these sections in stores, knowing thousands of products and formulas and ingredients, it's a lot. You really
It's
have to have a passion for it. Otherwise, you're not going to do it.
Yeah, or you won't be good. You'll just be a
Uh-huh.
robot, or you get one of those software things that just tells everybody the back to the box, right? Your approach
Yeah.
of, hey, one size, here's everybody goes, get in the box. I think you can get a lot better results if you talk to somebody, figure out what's going on, what are the tools that are likely to work best for you, and be willing to update in the face of new science, new trials, new evidence. I think there was a time when I was pretty against the spores, right? In the early
Mhm.
90s, there was a lot of kind of comparing them to anthrax, that it was like, oh, this is anthrax's cousin. This is a bad guy strain. Nobody should be supplementing this guy. And over the years, I've worked for companies where some of the head honchos were of that opinion, that have had bad results or anecdotally saw negative outcomes from taking spores. Spores referring to bacillus and the spore forming bacteria, for those that aren't nerds like us. And nowadays, I've read a lot more trials where I think they can be worthwhile. I think that the spore forming bacteria are certainly not as versatile, maybe, as all those lactose strains that we typically supplement, but they have some really neat outcomes. I think they're great anti-infective sometimes, where they can really change the uh, prognosis of bad critters, infectious material in the gut, and help really improve your immune system and help you fight that off. Maybe in some cases, even better than lactose strains. So I'll say that my opinion has been changed over the years many,
Yeah.
many times, not just on the cold shipping, not just on the cell count, not just on spores. There's so much new literature coming out every year. And to your point, we've got to be open to it and be willing to change our minds.
Well, I enjoyed this thoroughly, and this was very, very fun. I want to thank you for being here, and thank you for all you do in the industry. And we've had a great camaraderie for a very long time, and thank you for bringing the information here today.
Jeff, thank you for having me. It's been years since I've done any shows, and I feel quite rusty, but I feel like we got through a lot of great information that's pretty practical today. And I just really love your show, that you're out here doing this for people, and making this available and putting it out there without big paywalls. And, it's just, I think there's a lot of better resources in the industry, and I'm honored to be on the team that's helping you create these.
Thank you. Why don't you go ahead and leave everyone with a Bruce thought of the day?
The Bruce thought of the day. I would say that it's dietary fiber. And that if you look at the research on dietary fiber against heart disease, cancer, dementia, all cause mortality, it is insane, Jeff. And I know you know this, but it's like I whenever I start reading the kind of call outs on dietary fiber, how it's associated with this massive reduction in cancer or this massive reduction in heart disease, it makes me think, like, wow, if we had a pill, like if some pharmaceutical company could come up with a pill and it had all the same attributes, like this pill makes you reduce your risk of heart disease by 30% and your risk of dementia by 40% and it would be like a dang wonder drug. It'd be marketed everywhere. And that's exactly what dietary fiber does. So I would just remind people of that, is my thought, that even if you're eating a sugary diet, just try to get some sources of fiber into your gut on a regular basis. It will make a huge difference over the course of your life. So dietary fiber is like a wonder drug. That would be my final thought.
I want to thank everybody for being here today, and of course, my guest, Bruce Topping, for being here. And thank you for taking the time to tune in. Remember to tell your friends. The whole idea of this podcast, as it was for my radio show for over 4 decades, is bring information that's usable, understandable, not overwhelming, but definitely to the point, and information that we can utilize that can make our lives better. Because we want to all get healthy, be healthy, and stay healthy, but we need some help. We need some support. So what you do is you tell your friends, go to my webpage, drjeffreyburke.com. Once you're there, the easy thing to do on your phone is just save it to your home screen. And then all you have to do is tap on it. And then you can click on the Honest Health logo and directly go to Spotify and listen to the audio. Or you can tap on the YouTube and you can actually watch the interaction and with all my amazing guests. So just, while you're there, like it, follow it, subscribe, whatever all those buttons are. That's all new to me. So press the buttons if there's a button to be pressed, and come back and bring your friends with you, because we all want to pay it forward. We want to pay good information, good health information forward, because today we're in a time when we are stressed out, burnt out, fried out more than ever before. So if we can make tiny changes and have the information to make those changes, we're going to make dramatic differences in our health and well-being. My thank you to my guest today, Bruce. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome to have you. Will you come back again?
Oh, absolutely, Jeff.
That's what I want to hear. Have a great day, everyone. Take care and God bless.
Stay tuned for more information from the Honest Health Podcast with Jeffrey Burke. And make sure to check back often for interviews and conversations from the guests we all want to hear from. I'm John the Announcer. Thanks for listening.